There's a reason your garden feels like starting over every year, and it's not your fault. It's not your soil, it's not your timing, and it's not because you're not good at this. It's because of the way your garden is built. Every spring, the same scene repeats. A table covered in seed packets, plastic trays waiting to be filled, labels, notes, plans, and this quiet pressure that you need to get everything right before the season slips away. Because if you miss the timing, or something fails early, you don't just lose a plant, you lose the whole system. And that's the part no one really talks about. Most gardens are designed to reset. Every plant dies, every root disappears, every bit of progress gets erased. So when spring comes back, you're not continuing anything. You're rebuilding from zero. Again, and if you've ever felt like your garden never quite gets easier, like every year demands the same energy, the same cost, the same effort, that's why. Not because you're doing it wrong, but because the system you're using forgets itself. But here's what's strange. If that's really how growing food works, then nothing in nature should be stable. Forests wouldn't exist. Ecosystems wouldn't hold together. Everything would collapse and restart over and over again. But that's not what happens. Step outside early in the season, before you've planted anything, and look closely. There are plants already growing. No trays, no timing, no effort, just small shoots pushing through cold soil. Because they never left, their roots are still there. Holding energy, holding structure, holding memory, and when the conditions are right, they don't need to be planted again, they just return. That's the difference most people never see, because we've been taught to think of gardening as something you start. But in reality, the strongest systems are the ones you don't have to restart. And once you see that, something shifts. Because the goal stops being, how do I grow more this year? And becomes, how do I stop rebuilding my garden every single season? Once you see it, it's hard to unsee the difference between a garden that resets and a garden that remembers. Because most of what we're taught focuses on the visible part of the plant, leaves, stems, fruit. That's where our attention goes. That's what we measure. That's what we try to improve. But the real story of whether a plant returns or disappears is happening somewhere else entirely. Underground, where you don't usually look. Every time you plant an annual crop, you're starting with a blank slate. A seed pushes down a small root system. It grows quickly, produces what it can, and then, at the end of the season, everything collapses. The roots break down, the structure disappears. Whatever that plant learned about that exact patch of soil is gone. So the next year, you repeat the process. New seed, new roots, new beginning. That's not failure. That's just how annual plants are designed. But it creates a garden that can never carry momentum. Now compare that to a plant that doesn't die back in the same way, a perennial. Instead of collapsing completely, it pulls its energy downward. It stores it in thickened roots, crowns, or underground stems. It doesn't disappear. It waits, through cold, through heat, through time. And when the season turns, it doesn't start from zero. It starts from storage. That one difference changes everything. Because a root system that has already spent a year, or 2, or 5, in the ground is not guessing anymore. It knows the soil. It has already pushed past the shallow layer. It has already found moisture. It has already built pathways. So when growth begins again, it doesn't hesitate. It moves faster, stronger, earlier. That's why some plants are already up and growing while you're still deciding what to plant. They're not ahead because they're better. They're ahead because they never stopped. And once you understand that, the usual question starts to feel incomplete. It's no longer just, what should I grow this year? It becomes, what can I grow once and keep? That shift sounds small, but it changes the way you design everything. Because instead of thinking in seasons, you start thinking in layers of time. Some plants for this year, some plants for next year, some plants that will still be there, long after you've stopped thinking about when you planted them. That's how older gardens used to work, not as a collection of crops, but as a structure. Something that settled in, something that improved. Something that didn't need to be rebuilt from memory every spring. And once you begin to build even a small part of your garden that way, something surprising happens. The pressure drops. You don't need everything to go right at once. You don't need perfect timing across the entire space, because part of your food system is already in place. Already growing, already carrying work forward for you. That's the hidden advantage. Not just less effort, but less urgency, less fragility, more stability. And that's where perennial vegetables come in. Not as a replacement for everything else you grow, but as the foundation that stops your garden from forgetting itself. Because once that foundation exists, you're no longer starting from zero. You're building on something that's already alive. The easiest way to see this difference is to look at what happens before the season even begins. Not in your seed trays, not on your calendar, in the soil. There's a moment, usually early in the year, when the ground still feels cold to the touch. Most of the garden looks empty, quiet, like nothing has started yet. But then you notice something. A small cluster of green pushing up through last year's leaves. No one planted it this week, no one watered it, no one checked the forecast. And yet it's already growing. That's not luck. That's stored energy being released at the right time. Take something like asparagus. If you've ever grown it, the first year feels almost disappointing. Thin shoots, slow growth, not much to harvest. It doesn't feel worth the space. But underground, something else is happening. Instead of putting everything into one fast season, the plant is building a crown, thickening its root system, expanding its reach, storing energy in a way you don't immediately see. So by the time the second or third year comes around, it doesn't behave like a new plant anymore. It behaves like something established. The shoots come up earlier, stronger, more consistent, not because you improved your technique, but because the plant stopped starting over. That same pattern shows up in other perennial vegetables too. Plants that spread quietly, divide over time, or return from the same base year after year. They don't ask for the same kind of attention. They don't depend on perfect timing. They don't collapse at the end of every cycle. They just continue. And once you start placing a few of these into your garden, you begin to notice a shift. Spring feels different. Instead of standing in front of an empty space trying to bring it to life, you walk out and find that part of it is already alive, already moving, already ahead of you. That changes the relationship completely, because now your role is not to create the entire garden from scratch. It's to support something that's already in motion, and that's where the real advantage begins to show. Perennial plants don't just return, they compound. Each year, the root system grows a little deeper. The structure becomes a little more stable. The plant becomes a little more resilient, which means the work you put in once doesn't disappear, it stays in the ground. It carries forward. You can see this clearly when you compare two spaces side by side. One bed, planted with annuals, cleared at the end of each season. Another, anchored with perennials that have been there for years. The annual bed always looks like a fresh start. The perennial bed looks like something that has settled, thicker growth, earlier emergence, less hesitation. It's not that one is better in every situation. It's that one is building memory, and the other is erasing it. That's the hidden mechanism most people never think about. Roots are not just holding the plant in place, they're holding time. Every inch they grow is work that doesn't have to be repeated. Every season they survive is energy that doesn't have to be rebuilt. And when enough of your garden starts working that way, something subtle but powerful happens. You stop chasing the season because part of your garden is already there, waiting for it. Once you start seeing your garden this way, the question shifts again. Not just what grows back, but how to place it so it actually works for you. Because one of the most common mistakes people make with perennial vegetables is treating them like annuals. They tuck them into random spaces, move them around, expect quick results in the first season, and when that doesn't happen, they assume the plant isn't worth it. But perennials aren't built for speed. They're built for stability, which means where you put them matters more than how many you plant. Think about a plant that's going to stay in the ground for years. It's not just filling space for one season, it's claiming that space. Its roots are going to expand outward. Its crown will get larger. Its presence will become more permanent over time. So instead of asking, where can I fit this right now? The better question becomes, where can this plant stay? That's why the strongest perennial gardens often look a little different. They're not rearranged every year. They're structured. Edges of beds, corners that don't get disturbed, areas where the soil can remain relatively stable, places where digging, pulling, and constant change won't interrupt what's happening below the surface. Because once a perennial settles in, the goal is not to restart it. The goal is to let it deepen. Another mistake is expecting immediate payoff. With annuals, you plant, you wait, you harvest. With perennials, the first year often feels quiet. Growth is slower. Harvest is limited. Nothing dramatic happens above ground. And that's exactly when most people lose patience. But if you could see below the soil, it would look very different. Roots expanding, energy being stored, structure being built. The plant is investing, not just in this season, but in every season that comes after. That's why leaving it alone becomes one of the most powerful things you can do. Not ignoring it completely, but resisting the urge to constantly interfere, to dig it up, to divide it too early, to treat it like something temporary. Because the real advantage of perennials only appears when they are allowed to stay, and when they do, the maintenance changes. You're no longer replanting. You're observing. You're adjusting around something stable instead of replacing something fragile. And that opens the door to a different kind of efficiency, not the fast kind, the lasting kind. You begin to notice that some areas of your garden need less attention each year. They don't need to be reseeded. They don't need to be rebuilt. They don't even need to be remembered in the same way, because they're already there, already doing what they were designed to do, quietly, consistently, and that's where the system starts to form. Not from adding more plants, but from allowing certain ones to anchor the space, to hold it in place, to carry time forward for you. Once that happens, everything else becomes easier to layer on top. Annuals still have their place, but now they're supported by something underneath, something that doesn't disappear when the season ends. And that's the point most people miss. You don't need to replace your whole garden. You just need to stop building all of it on things that vanish. Because when even part of your garden becomes permanent, the entire system starts to change. There's a different kind of mourning that happens in a garden like this. It doesn't start with urgency. It doesn't start with a checklist, or trays that need to be filled, or a narrow window that feels like it's closing. It starts quietly. You step outside early in the season, expecting to see the same empty ground you've seen every year. And instead, Something is already there. Small shoots pushing up where you left them. Clusters of growth returning in the exact same place. Plants you haven't thought about in months, already awake. No effort, no restart. Just continuation. And in that moment, the entire feeling of the garden shifts. Because you're no longer trying to bring it to life. You're walking into something that's already alive. That's the real payoff. Not just less work, though there is less work. Not just saving money on seeds and replacements, though that happens too. It's the change in pressure. The removal of that constant feeling that everything depends on you getting it right at exactly the right time. Because now, it doesn't. Part of your garden is already carrying the season forward, already producing before you intervene. Already doing what it was designed to do without asking you to rebuild it. And over time, that compounds. One plant becomes a cluster becomes a section becomes a pattern, until you start to realize something subtle but powerful. You're no longer managing a garden, you're maintaining a system. And systems behave differently. They don't rely on perfect execution. They rely on continuity, on pieces that remain in place, on elements that support each other over time instead of resetting independently. That's why older, established gardens often feel different. Not necessarily bigger, not necessarily more impressive at first glance, but more stable, more predictable, more forgiving, because they've been allowed to remember. And that's the part most people never consider. We've been taught to approach growing food as something you recreate each year. But nature doesn't work that way. The strongest systems aren't the ones that can restart perfectly. They're the ones that don't need to restart at all. They carry energy forward. They build on what's already there. They become easier because they stop erasing their own progress. And once you begin to build your garden like that, even in a small way, it changes how you see everything else. You stop asking how to optimize each season and start asking how to make each season matter long term, because a plant that returns is more than a convenience. It's stored time. It's stored work. It's a piece of your effort that didn't disappear, and when enough of your garden starts holding on to that, you don't just grow food. You build something that continues without you needing to restart it every year. Something that remembers. And once your garden begins to remember, you never really go back to building it from zero again.